My daughter and I were recently playing a fierce game of I Spy. She said, "I spy something white." I said, "Well, is it that guy's socks over there, or that lady's purse, or what about that sign over there across the field?" I made 20 or so guesses and I couldn't figure it out. I didn't see what she saw. But I'm hoping that after this talk, it'll be quite obvious to you. Let me make it obvious. A couple years ago, my family and I walked to a park nearby our house. This is a park that we frequent fairly often, probably once a week. But this particular evening, I decided that I wanted to exercise while the kids played on the playground. My daughter, who was 3 at the time, had other plans, which involved Mommy not leaving her, and she promptly started crying and throwing a fit. I decided to continue on my futile exercise journey, and my husband stayed at the playground with the kids. Unbeknownst to me, someone saw my husband with the crying three-nager and perceived a threat and called the police. The police came, they questioned my husband, they asked him where he lived, if these were in fact his children, and where their mother was. The police officer was polite, but reported that someone had called in a concern. And there are many other similar stories. One day I was out to lunch with my kids. I was paying the bill, and I turned around to see that my son was being ushered out the door with another family who looked more like him. I dropped my wallet, I ran out the door and said, "No, wait, he's mine." My kids are frequently asked if they are adopted, or, "Is that your mom?" One day, I was out shopping as a new mom, and someone actually asked me if I left my child in the sun. Now, of course, the piece I didn't tell you about these stories is that although I'm white, my husband is black, and we are raising 2 biracial children. And our benign trip to the park that evening was once again another reminder of our race and how it affects our social environment. These stories taken together demonstrate that race has always been salient to my children. It's something that we talk about on a regular basis. But that was not the case for me. While I consider myself fairly racially conscious, I was much older when I first thought about my race. I have a vivid memory of attending a predominantly black Baptist church with my youth group, scanning the congregation and thinking, "Whew, I am white." But that was probably in middle school. My son, on the other hand, could articulate his identification as brown as soon as he had language, as soon as he knew which crayon to pick from the box. Now, I should also mention I am a social psychologist who studies race. I talk about race and racial identity and interracial relationships in my classes and in my research. But I don't think that I really understood the impact of my race until I saw it through the lens of my children's eyes. Shelley Talkluck discusses in her book, Witnessing Whiteness, that whites are like fish. They do not realize the water that they swim in. Our society is normed on white privilege, our laws, our policies, our expectations, and so whites can and therefore avoid thinking and acknowledging their race. I would like to talk to you about developing a healthy racial identity, to acknowledge that water that we swim in. But I also want to warn you, it's not easy. Many people don't want to think about what it means to be white, to own their whiteness. We avoid the topic because we don't want to appear biased or prejudicial. And of course, we may stumble along the way, but it is still necessary. I also want to encourage you to not only acknowledge the water that we swim in, but to make some action and take waves. Let me ask you a difficult question. When did you first think about your race? Can you identify an age, a conversation, maybe an experience, while traveling, with friends, with family, at church. If you are a majority member, like me, the answer is probably in your late childhood or adolescence. Did your race impact your childhood? Again, if you're a majority member, the answer is probably no, or not that I remember. But that's likely not the case if you are a minority member. Research indicates that racial identity develops at a much younger age for minorities, as early as age 7 or 8. We are not colorblind. We do not transcend race. And while you may have been taught at some point that America is the melting pot and we see people as people, we also know that social categorization is a natural process. Our brains are hardwired to categorize people into groups. And so as you walk through your hallways of your schools and your workplaces and your malls, you are categorizing people into groups. Old versus young, black versus white, male versus female. But ultimately, you are categorizing into groups of people who are like me and people who are not like me. And race is one of the most common identifiers. This in-group versus out-group categorization reinforces the principle of conferred dominance that Peggy McIntosh first discussed when she was defining white privilege. The idea that certain groups would have positions of power over another. McIntosh was originally looking at male privilege, and it was only then that she realized as a white female that she also experienced another form of privilege, that based on her race. In her seminal article, Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack, she discusses many unearned entitlements that one may experience as a result of privilege. There are many forms of privilege, that based on our race, or our gender, or our age, or our occupation, or religion. So I know that as a white female, as I shop, I'm not going to be followed by security. I can look through a textbook and see people who look like me. I can voice a concern at work and not experience retaliation. I can take a crying 3-year-old to the park and no one's going to call the police. How would you complete this sentence? I am what? Whites typically do not list their race as a self-description, but blacks do. And research supports the same finding for other marginalized groups. Women are more likely to list their gender than are men. Gays are more likely to list their sexuality than are those who are not gay. So, how do we own our whiteness without coming off as a white nationalist? Tim Wise is an active anti-racist activist, and he writes in the introduction of his book, White Like Me, that only by coming to realize how thoroughly racialized our white lives are can we begin to see the problem as ours and begin to take action to help solve it. By remaining oblivious to the racialization, we also remain oblivious to the injustice that stems from it, and we remain paralyzed when it comes to responding to it in a constructive manner. So how do we overcome this obliviousness? Janet Helms is a well-known scholar in the area of racial identity development, and she argues that whites transition through distinct stages as they develop their racial identity. Initially, we are unaware of our race or the impact of racial stereotypes. And as we become more aware, we also start to feel guilty. But a fully developed white racial identity resists prejudices and acknowledges the impact of our race. Helms also argues that developing a racial identity is hard work. It is cognitively taxing. So this isn't a survey that I can complete, or a mail-in genetics test or ancestry inventory online. It's not a conversation that I can have or a competency I can list on my resume, but rather the steadfast attention that I give to my race and my social interactions. And we may stumble along the way, I still get slapped in the face with my privilege sometimes. I recently went to the store to return something with my husband. I waltzed right in, mind you, in an unmarked bag with no receipt, to the back of the store where the customer service desk was, only to turn around and see my husband at the beginning of the store with a mortified look on his face. Because as a person of color, he would never walk into a store with merchandise without checking with an employee first. So, as we attempt to think intentionally about our race and our privilege, let's make some waves. And WAVES is my acronym for witnessing, action, voice, empathy, and being a student. The first step is to witness. Witness that privilege and oppression exist. We cannot accomplish any social change until we acknowledge our experiences, our affordances, and our racial identity. The second step in making waves is to take action. As you think about your role, you might ask yourself, am I an activist or an advocate? Advocates are those who speak up for those who are oppressed. An activist is someone who makes intentional efforts. But there are ways to be an activist beyond protesting or marching for a cause. Be mindful of your money. Patronize Black-owned or gay-friendly businesses. Donate to nonprofit or advocacy agencies. Next, use your voice. Talk about race. Don't let it be the white elephant in the room. Discuss it at home, with your family, with your friends, and your students. Read books to your children about race and diversity issues. Check on the programming at your workplace or your child's school. And if you think it's not sufficient, join the planning committee. Call out a behavior that you think is biased or discriminatory. Remember, our silence is compliance. Next, practice empathy. Acknowledging privilege requires that we imagine what the consequences might be if we were a member of a different social group. If we could take more time to listen to the experiences of others, we would be more likely to recognize that our privilege has shaped our own experiences. Lastly, always be a student. Read, vote, sign online petitions, process, discuss. Think about the books that you read, the TV that you watch, the neighborhoods that you frequent. Do you consume because they are comfortable, or do they expose a different perspective? As we strive to be socially conscious, we need to be students in each new environment, paying attention to the social dynamics and the potential barriers. Taken together, as we witness, give voice, practice empathy, and be a student, these small waves will assist us in better understanding ourselves and our social environments. So, can you guess what my daughter spied? It was me. I am white. And although I am proud that she has the vocabulary and is comfortable talking about race, it is once again another example that it is not obvious to many, and it's hard to talk about. We have a social responsibility to acknowledge our race and our privileges. And so I hope that you will join me in making some small waves of your own. Thank you.